Good, yes. Would you like to ask Mr. Osborne to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Osborne, ready to carry on?
I'm ready. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Mr. Osborne, just to pick up on a couple of points arising from your evidence this morning. You talked about the red pen drawings that had the cavity barriers marked on them and where you were to put the cavity barriers. Was that a drawing of a bay, just one bay of Grenfell Tower?
No, it was the side of a side elevation of the building.
A side elevation?
Complete side elevation of the building.
Yeah, okay. And they were marked from top to bottom on that, were they?
Correct.
Great, thank you. So I now want to ask you some questions about the choice of materials and the compliance of those materials. Just turning to page 2 of your first witness statement, this is OSB 6087 at page 2, and at paragraph 4D, you at the top of that page, you're asked the question, was the exterior of the building compliant with relevant building regulations, fire regulations, etc.? And you say this, I do not know the answer to this question. I worked on the basis that all materials supplied to us for installation by Harley were compliant. Did you ever have any discussions about issues of compliance with building regulations with anybody at Harley or any other person on the project?
Not at all.
No. Did you ever have any discussions with anyone on the project, including on site, about the performance of the materials you were installing and specifically their fire performance?
I don't think so.
No, okay.
From memory, I would say no.
Yeah. Did you yourself ever have reason to consider the fire performance of the products that you were installing?
Not at the time, but
No.
hindsight, yes. Now I do.
Yeah. Had you ever heard of the term class naught or national class naught at the time?
Yes, I have.
In what context? What did you think that meant?
I thought that was a non-burnable product.
And did you ever have any discussions with anyone, or did you ever come across the term class naught on the Grenfell project?
I believe the installation was supposed to be a class naught.
Yeah. Did you ever discuss that specifically with anybody?
No, not at all.
But if I'd asked you at the time about the fire properties of the insulation, would you have said it's a class naught product?
Probably not.
No, okay.
Probably not.
But that was your belief, was it?
That's my belief.
Yeah. Now, the aluminium composite material panels, if we can go back to the bill of quants that you were sent, this is OSB 7051 at page 2. And if we look on that page, yes, page 2, what we see under each of the headings there is, well, we see the headings are zinc rain screen to columns, and zinc rain screen to crown screen, zinc rain screen to walls. And then underneath each of those headings, we see it says Proteus rain screen system KME.
That's correct.
Yeah. And we know also that there's reference to H92 in brackets. We know that's a reference to the cladding section of the NBS specification on the project. Now, we know from the documents and from speaking to other witnesses that by August 2014, a decision had been made to seek planning approval to change from zinc to ACM, aluminium cladding material. Were you ever told that ACM panels were going to be used in place of zinc panels?
No, we assumed it was ACM panels from day one, as far as I can remember.
So did you ever look at this document? I mean, you said you were involved with Mr. Berry in drawing up the price in response to this. Did you notice?
I didn't tie that in, that Proteus rain screen system. Because by that time, I'm sure we were under the impression it was a ACM panel. not a zinc panel.
I see. So is it your evidence that you didn't notice that it said Proteus rain screen system?
That's correct.
And that is it also your evidence that you think by the time you were pricing the project that you were aware it was ACM?
I think it could be, yes.
But you can't recall who might have told you
I
that?
can't recall for sure.
Sorry. I think we're having a tendency to speak. You're speaking quite quickly, sometimes in response to my question, and I know it's my fault too. We've got to try and separate them out so the transcriber can hear nice and clearly. So you knew at the time you were installing these panels, did you, that they were ACM aluminium panels and not zinc rain screen panels?
I knew they weren't zinc, but I couldn't give you a guarantee. I knew it was what it was going to be. All I knew it was going to be an aluminium panel,
Yeah.
basically.
Did you know that they were called Rainabond panels and that they'd been manufactured by Alcoa or Arconic?
At the time, no.
Did they have any kind of markings on them which would have
When
told
they
you?
arrived on site, most definitely. There was low-tack tape across the panels with the name Renabond written on them in bold letters.
Yeah. Can we just turn to a document? This is BBA 6047. This is the BBA certificate for the Rainabond ACM panels that were installed on the tower. It's dated, or it's first issued in January 2008. We can see that from the bottom of the page in the pale blue box. Have you ever seen this document before?
Not at all.
No. Would you ever, as an installer, come to look at something like a BBA certificate on a project?
No, not that I can remember. Not that I can remember. You would just be told what you're going to fit, basically.
Yeah. So can we take it that you didn't look at this at any time during your involvement on the Grenfell project?
That's correct.
Now, if we turn on to page 3 of this certificate, there's a section headed General at the top of the page. And in the third paragraph down, it says this: it is important for designers, planners, contractors and/or installers to ensure that the installation of the cladding is in accordance with the certificate holder's instructions and the information given in this certificate. Do you see that there?
I do.
Did you know at the time you were fitting the panels that you had to ensure that the installation was in accordance with the certificate holder's instructions and information in the BBA certificate?
I did not.
Were you ever provided with any separate instructions from Alcoa or Arconic, the manufacturer of the panels, which had to be followed by those installing the cladding?
Not at all.
Did you ever ask to see any information from the manufacturer of the panels to check that the installation was being carried out in line with its requirements?
No.
And why not? Was that not information that you needed or ought to check?
I took my instructions from Harley. I would have assumed they would have got somebody down if it was necessary to actually check it.
Yeah. Does that mean that it wasn't usual for you to check manufacturer's instructions before installing materials in a rain screen cladding system?
That's correct.
And then if we turn on to page 6 of this certificate, section 10, it also says there in part 10.2, in the middle of that page, installers must be trained and approved by the certificate holder who can provide technical assistance at the design stage and at the start of the installation. Now, was Osborne Berry trained at any stage by Alcoa or Arconic?
Not at all.
Was Osborne Berry at any stage approved by Alcoa or Arconic as an installer of its panels?
No.
Were you aware when you were fitting the panels on the building that the fixing for the panels deviated from the standard Arconic detail for cassette systems hung on bolts?
No. Not.
You weren't aware of that?
Weren't aware of that.
What did you think was inside the core of the panels when you were installing them?
Some kind of plastic membrane.
So So you did notice that they had a core.
Yes, most definitely.
And is that all you knew about it, that it was some kind of plastic membrane?
Correct.
Did you know it was polyethylene or PE?
I think it was probably on the panels, on the actual low-tack tape on the panels. I think it could have had PE written on there, but I can't be sure now. It's a while back.
Had you come across polyethylene or PE previous to the Grenfell project?
We used the same panel on Little Venice, but from a different manufacturer.
Yeah. Did you know anything about the fire performance of PE at the time you were installing the panels?
Not at the time I installed it, no.
Did you ever have any discussions with anyone during the project about the fire performance of that core?
Not that I can remember.
Were you aware that the polyethylene core of the panel was exposed around its perimeter when you were installing it?
Yes.
And again, did you ever discuss that with Harley or any other party on the project?
No.
Now, if we can go to the transcript of Mr. Hughes's evidence of Ryden, if we can look at day 27, page 54. And I want to pick up from line 7. So Mr. Hughes was asked, were you aware at the time of working on the project that if a fire occurred in the building which led to significant flames being ejected from the window, the cladding panels would likely fail because they would melt and fall off the building? Was that something that you were ever made aware of? And then he says this, I had one conversation with Taff about it, but my understanding, or what I got in my head, was the actual fixings, the lug system where you hook the panel on, that little bit there would fail just through heat. In the same way I was told at Chalcott's they warped. So I think it was more of a warping that I expected, or the plastic might lose a little bit of strength. And then he's asked, when you say you had one conversation with Taff about it, yes. Were you then just describing the conversation you had with Taff? Yes, that's it, sorry, yes. Now, do you see that there?
I do. I had so many conversations with Dave, I can't remember if I did say this or not, but I wouldn't deny it, because I
Okay.
do not know, or cannot remember.
So you can't recall whether you had any conversations with him about what might happen to the panels if significant flames were ejected from the window?
Not off the top of my head, no.
No, okay. Can we just look over at page, the next page? Sorry, I just want to check I've picked up everything I need to. No, that's it. Yes, thank you. Now, the crown. I now want to ask you just some questions about the architectural crown of the building. If we look at your second witness statement at page 12, this is OSB 6090. And I want to look at what you say at paragraph 21A at the top of that page. And you're asked, please explain the work involved in making top crown angle panels. Please give a description of the scope of Osborne Berry's work in this respect. And then you say this, Harley supplied the top crown panels. These panels arrived in flat pack. They needed to be angled by bending and riveting together before installing onto the building. Now, I just want to ask you a bit more about that work. Was that work, in terms of bending and riveting these flat panels together, was that done by Osborne Berry?
It was.
And was that done according to instructions from Harley?
It was.
Yeah. And who gave those instructions?
It's a little bit more detailed than that. The panels would come from the manufacturer
Yes.
with all the grooving in them. So the panel was 3 mil thick. There'd be a groove put in it, which you then folded together and then riveted the edges together, basically, to hold it together. So the panel would come from the manufacturer pre-manufactured. You just folded it up into this panel. Because the size of the panels, you would have never moved them up the building if you didn't have them in flat pack. They would have been too large to carry on the mast climbers. So you literally took them up there, built them in place, bent them round, and then riveted them to their rails where they needed to be.
I see. Yeah. So that's to create these
To create the
C-shaped,
crown cone,
the
yes.
C-shaped channels on the
Yes,
building.
yes,
Is that right?
Yes. They all just fold in and fold round, and then your rails are up in the building, straight up the building. You rivet them to the rails. That holds them in place then.
Yeah, that's helpful. Was that work done by reference to any drawings or any other installation guidance?
It would have been done to a drawing, definitely. There'd have been a drawing about for it somewhere.
Yeah. Do you know whether any records were kept of the way in which those panels were bent and riveted?
Not that I know to, no. You'd have to ask Harley for that one.
And then if we look at the next paragraph down on that page, at 21B, you go on, you're asked, please explain the work involved in making infill panels for back of crown panels on roof area. Please give a description of the scope of Osborne Berry's work in this respect. And you answer, Osborne Berry installed the top crown panels as specified by Harley. However, the building instructor did not like the gaps at the back of the panels where they came down to the parapet, and therefore Osborne Berry were instructed by Harley to infill the gaps with cladding panels. Now, just to ask you a few things about that, who was the building instructor that you're referring to there?
That would be the clerk of the works,
Right, so was that John White?
John White.
And you have a clear recollection that it was John White, do you?
I have a recollection it was John White.
And can you just help us as to exactly what he wasn't happy with about the way these panels...
Having big gaps, it aesthetically didn't look pretty.
And can you just help us, where were those gaps?
If you were on the roof looking out,
Yeah.
you could see the gaps between the top panels and the concrete facade. So he wanted the concrete facade filled up so that it covered the gap between the panel and the concrete facade. So you couldn't see into the panel, basically.
I see. So, and where exactly were the gaps? Were they in each rivet?
In each corner.
In each
around
corner.
each frame of the panel. It's hard to explain. If you've
Yeah.
got a panel shaped like that, there was a gap appeared like that around it. And
Yeah.
you wanted those gaps filled in, basically, so
I
that you
see.
couldn't see into the back of the panel.
Yeah. And what were those panels infilled then with more ACM?
They were infilled with more ACM, as I remember.
Yeah. So more ACM was applied to the arrangement
Yes.
to fill in the gaps at the top of the panels,
Yes.
where they tapered off at the
Yes,
top.
correct. That's correct.
And who came up with that solution on site?
I cannot remember, but I would think it's probably Kevin Lamb.
Right. Do you know whether any other parties were made of that change other than Harley and Osborne Berry? Do you know whether that solution was ever discussed with Studio E?
I wouldn't know that,
No.
but I would be sure it was discussed with Rydens.
Yeah. Okay. And can you recall when this was going on the project?
I can't.
Approximately? I mean,
It's towards the end of the project.
yeah.
Getting very close to the project being finished, basically.
Right. So,
Within the last 6 months of the project.
yeah. So probably sometime in 2016?
Yes. Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, turning to the insulation, were you aware of what the different types of insulation boards were that were being used between levels 4 and 23 on the spandrels and the columns?
No. No.
Did you know who had manufactured that insulation and what product it was?
I did know it was Celotex, yes.
How did you know it was Celotex?
It was written on the boards.
Was there a branding on all of the Celotex boards? We've been told by some witnesses that some of the Celotex boards were unbranded.
Could well be. That doesn't surprise me. That could well be.
Yeah.
Could well be.
Is it common that sometimes that
Yes,
kind of boarding
yes,
isn't
yes,
branded?
Yes. I have seen it before.
Were you aware that another product was also used, a Kingspan K15 product?
I was.
And how did you, when did you become aware of that? Can you help us?
When it arrived on site,
Yeah.
and I believe the reason that it was used was because Celotex couldn't produce enough to keep us going, so Kingspan was bought in its place, basically.
Yeah. And can you help us as to precisely where on the tower that Kingspan product went?
From my memory, I think most of it went on the north elevation,
Right.
above what I call the grid. There's like a big metal deck fitted between the floor and the first floor. Above that, I believe that's where the Kingspan was fitted.
Was it ever fitted above level 4?
That I cannot remember.
Can we just look at a photograph? If we go to RYD 51704. Now this photograph, it's not hugely clear, but basically if we look at the third level above the mast climber, we think we can see some Kingspan branding.
You're right, you can.
Yeah, on the insulation. So we can see where the white window infill panels are. What's above and below those? That's the ACM panels, isn't it?
That's the Renabon panels.
Yeah.
Yes.
But then we can see in a couple of locations above that mast climber that the insulation has got, and I think you can see it, is it like a lion?
Yes, I think that's correct.
And with Kingspan across it.
I think you're right.
And we think this is either the east face or the west face because of the number of columns that we're seeing in the building.
Can you take me down to the ground floor of the building again, by any chance?
Yeah, we can pan out as far as this photograph goes.
Yes, if that'll do. That is the east face of the building.
Right. Thank you. That's helpful. Did you know at the time that Celotex was a polyisocyanurate, PIR, insulation board and Kingspan was a phenolic insulation board?
I didn't know.
No. Did you know that both of these products were combustible insulation boards?
At the time, no.
Had you ever used a product called Celotex FR5000 before on other projects? Do you ever come across that FR5000?
I have a feeling we might have used it on Commercial Road.
Right. Okay. And what about K15? Had you ever used Kingspan K15 on other high-rise buildings?
I've never used K15 anywhere before in my life. This is the first time we use K15.
Right. Okay. And can you recall how long was it into the project that you were first asked to be installing the Kingspan insulation instead of the Celotex?
Probably late 2015.
Yeah.
Early 2016. I would
Right.
say late 2015, more likely.
Yeah. And were there several batches of Kingspan that were swapped in, or only one, to your knowledge?
I personally think there was only one load bought in.
Okay. At any point on the project, did you come to look at the Celotex or Kingspan brochures regarding guidance on installation?
Not at all.
Were you aware that the Celotex product you were installing was a new product called RS5000?
No,
No. So you didn't know it was a new product at all?
not at all.
No. Okay. So I now want to move to cavity barriers and ask you some more detailed questions about the cavity barriers. If we can start by looking at page 7 of your first witness statement, that's OSB 6087 at page 7. And I want to look at paragraph 11. The question is asked, what training did Osborne Berry give to those installing the facade and windows, in particular with regard to fitting cavity barriers? And you say this, on-site training was provided to those who were employed to assist Osborne Berry in the installation process. And then you say this, Osborne Berry had no involvement in relation to the fitting of cavity barriers.
That was a mistake by me. I don't call them cavity barriers, I call them fire breaks.
Right. I see.
And that was a total mistake by me.
Yeah. So you agree that you were
Yes, we definitely
involved
fitted cavity barriers. But
in fitting
as I
cavity
say,
barriers?
I've always called them fire breaks, always known them as fire breaks.
Yeah. Okay. Now, if we can go to Osborne Berry's position statement and look at page 1, this is OSB 7084, and I want to pick it up in paragraph 8 at the bottom of the page. And this position statement gives a summary of the installation process and goes through the stages. And then if we go over onto page 2, at little Roman numeral 9, 3 up from the bottom, we can see it says there vertical and horizontal and fire breaks were installed as per elevation drawing. Now, where you're referring there to fire breaks, is that what we know as cavity barriers?
That's what you know as cavity barriers.
Yeah.
Yes.
And just to be clear, the reason why you don't describe them as cavity barriers, is that because you've always known them as fire breaks?
Always known them as fire breaks.
Yeah.
Ever since I've done the job, they've always been called fire breaks.
Yeah. What if you were doing fire stopping, properly so called? So fire stopping to take a compartment floor internally out to a wall?
That would be a fully sealed fire system.
Right, I see.
Whereas the cavity barriers have a gap between them with an intermittent strip
Yeah,
to expand, take up the gap.
yeah. And you know that as fire breaks?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, we saw previously that we looked at those minutes of that subcontractor meeting in April 2015, where it said that Ben Bailey of Harley was to issue elevations showing the position of fire breaks. Let's just look at that for a moment. So this is RYD 30088923. So if we go within this to page 3 and look at item 9.01, here it says windows and fire breaks being fitted to the north, east and west elevations. Now, do you think that's right, that in April 2015, installation of fire breaks to the north, east and west elevations had commenced?
I would think very much so.
Then looking back on page 2, and we saw this earlier, item 6.03. Sorry, I think it must be on the next page. Yes, sorry, thank you. Page 3. We see there BB, Ben Bailey, to issue elevations showing positions of fire breaks on all elevations to Daniel Osgood. Can you help us as to why, if the installation of the cavity barriers had commenced, why are we seeing only at this point that Ben Bailey is issuing elevations showing the positions of fire breaks on all elevations?
I cannot answer that question,
Yeah.
but I would say drawings were for fire breaks were well in advance of that because we'd done the sample panel way prior to that.
Yeah.
That's what I thought everything was working off, or I was instructed that is how you're going to proceed, basically.
Yeah. And when you say we'd done the sample panel well in advance of that, can you explain what you're referring to there?
We did a panel on north elevation, 16th floor. Between 15 and 16, we actually did a mock-up panel. We fitted a window into the actual flat.
Yeah.
We fitted the insulation onto the wall. We fitted the fire break on the wall for inspection by everybody due to what I was saying with regard to the EPDM barrier.
Yeah. And can you help us as to when you did that mock-up?
Memory for me, no.
Yeah.
But my business partner would probably know that quite well.
Great, we can ask him.
Yeah.
Okay. So you already had drawings, did you, showing the positions of cavity barriers by this time?
Yes,
And were those the red line
they
drawings
were the red line drawings.
you were talking about?
Yes.
Now, if we look back now to the schedule of quantities, the bill of quantities that we looked at before, OSB 7051, and look at page 2, under the heading zinc rain screen to columns at the top of that page, we can see there we've got vertical fire stops, 362 metres. Do you see that one line up from the bottom? And then a little bit further down the page, under rain screen, zinc rain screen to walls, we have a reference to horizontal fire stops. Do you see that? Just at the bottom of that page. Yeah, and a quantity is given. Now, what was your understanding of what these items were when you were pricing this up?
The horizontal fire stops were the fire stops that had intermittent strip on them, which expanded. The vertical fire stops sealed up to the back of the panel. So there was no air gap.
And did you understand that they were two different products?
As for different products, the main material is the same, but one has a intermittent strip on it.
And one doesn't?
And one doesn't.
And did you understand that it was the horizontal cavity barrier that had the intermittent strip?
Correct, I did.
And did you understand that vertical cavity barriers are solid blocks of inert material, such as stone wool, that sit in the vertical position? Sorry, what was your answer?
Yes,
Thank
sorry.
you. Now, if we can just look at the NBS specification, this is SEA 50169. This is the architect's NBS specification that was part of the employer's requirements for Ryden and their work. Did you ever see this document, or indeed any extracts from it, do you think, when you were on the project?
Not at all.
No. If we look at page 246 within this document, here we can see that there's a provision for ventilated cavity barriers. In this spec, it said that the manufacturer was something called Downer cladding systems. And then we can see for the product reference, there's it says Lamatherm CWRS H60 horizontal, and then Lamatherm CWRS V60 vertical. Do you see that there?
I do.
And if we can turn then to the Harley specification of products to be used on the refurbishment, this is HAR 408991. So these are the Harley specification notes that we now know were drawn up by Kevin Lamb, and which set out in more detail the specific products that were to be used in the external wall. Did you ever see this set of notes on the project?
Not as I can remember, no.
Okay. Does that mean that the only formal information you had about the products which to be used came either from the drawings that you saw on site or the cost schedule, the bill of quantities that we saw previously?
It would have come from the drawings I'd seen on site.
Yeah. So you'd look to those drawings to tell you what the products were you?
Yes. You get a little box in the top right-hand corner telling you what products you were using, basically.
Right, I see. Now we can see on the right-hand side of this, in the right-hand column, about halfway down, for the refurb zones, we've got fire breaks, new build zones, then fire breaks, refurb zones. And we can see that two products are specified: horizontal siderized Lamatherm RH25G 9030 ventilated brakes, and then vertical siderized Lamatherm RVG 9030 full fill non-ventilated brakes. Now, so just to be clear, did you appreciate at the time that the horizontal and vertical cavity barriers were different products with different specifications?
I did.
And did you appreciate that the vertical were described as full fill, non-ventilated brakes?
I did.
And that they had different installation requirements?
I was informed how to install them, yes.
Yeah. Now, if we can turn to SIL 50230. This is some of the Siderise marketing material for those cavity barriers, which was, this is actually from October 2015, this particular piece of marketing material. Did you ever see this or anything similar at the time? Anything from Siderise, the manufacturer, explaining how the cavity barriers were to be fitted?
No.
And then if we can also pull up SIL 50227. Again, this is more manufacturer's information, including some installation guidance for cavity barriers for rain screen systems. This time it's from November 2013. Do you remember seeing anything like that on the project?
Not at all.
Did you ever ask to see any manufacturer's guidance or notes for the installation of the cavity barriers?
I did not.
And why not?
Because I'd done it on other jobs before, and I'd seen information as I'd gone along the line and been told different things of how to do it. So
Yeah.
I just carried on assuming it was the same. And looking at what I'm seeing here, it is no different to what was done on the tower.
Had you had experience of installing Siderise cavity barriers before on
Not
other
that
projects?
I can remember. Not that I can remember.
So did you not ever think it was important, if you were installing a new cavity barrier product, to check the manufacturer's instructions for how to install each product?
I do now, but I didn't at the time.
Okay, thank you. Now, if we look at page 2 of this guidance, we can see there's a helpful explanation on the top right of this page about the difference between horizontal and vertical cavity barriers. I just want to note this. So it says on the right-hand side at the very top, Siderise cavity barriers for rain screen cladding. Horizontal incorporates a continuous bonded intumescent strip to the leading edge and encapsulates in a weather-resistant polymer film. In the event of exposure to fire, this expands and fully seals the design ventilation gap formed at the time of installation between barrier and the rear of the cladding. You see that?
I do.
And again, was that your understanding of how the cavity barrier would operate in the event of exposure to fire?
That is correct.
And then underneath, immediately underneath, we've got Siderise cavity barriers for rain screen cladding. And it says vertical are specifically intended to fulfill the void. As a full-fill barrier system, the integral intumescent strip is not required. The front edge is finished as standard in a plain aluminium foil. This product is available with a factory-applied DBC pre-bonded to the surface. Can you see that?
I do.
And again, did you understand at the time that the intention, Harley's intention, was to install full-fill vertical cavity barriers with no intumescent strip?
I did.
Did you ever look at anything on the Siderise website, for example, any videos or other explanations on their website about how to fit the Siderise cavity barriers correctly?
I did not.
If we can look at page 6 of this document, it has some installation recommendations there, we can see at the top. And we can see that for the vertical cavity barrier, in the second paragraph it says this cavity barrier is fitted vertically under compression, completely filling the void. The product is installed with the plain mineral fibre edge positioned against the structural wall. Can you see that there?
I can.
Now, can you help us? Were you aware at the time that the vertical cavity barrier had to be fitted under compression?
With the system we were using, to actually put it under total compression would have been an impossibility. Because of the hook-on system, the way the panel went on, the panel would just move away from the barrier anyway.
Yeah.
The barrier just had to be very tight to the fire break.
I see.
That's all you could do, basically.
Right. Did you ever have any discussions with anyone on site about the fitting of vertical cavity barriers and whether or not they could be fitted under compression or what was practicable on site?
No, I did not.
Did Harley ever say to you, well, these barriers, we're told from Siderise they have to be fitted under compression. We need to find a solution. Did anyone from Harley raise that with you?
No.
If we just look at Mr. Ben Bailey's witness statement for a moment, this is page 9. This is HAR 30010060, page 9. I want to look at paragraph 27. And if we can look at the final sentence of paragraph 27. Actually, let's just pick it up a sentence before that. He says, 6 lines up, he says this: due to the significant lean of the building, cavity barriers intended for the columns were ordered oversized after TAF had taken on-site measurements which identified this issue. It was decided that cavity barriers with the largest dimension should be ordered so they could then be measured using a panel template and trimmed to size on site in each location by Osborne Berry and their installers. Now, can you just help us as to whether that was your understanding of what happened?
That was what happened, basically.
And can you help us with precisely what occurred then? He says it was decided that cavity barriers with the largest dimension should be ordered. What does that mean? Dimension in terms of width, in terms of breadth?
Because the columns moved up the building, like, for instance, into a spiral.
Yes.
The gap at the bottom was probably 280 mil from wall to face of panel, and at the top was 150 mil from wall to face of panel.
Yeah.
So different depths were made, not different widths, just different depths.
Yeah.
And they would be cut to suit to a template that would be hooked onto the rain screw rail system.
I see.
And then all of it would be trimmed to that template, basically.
So does that mean you needed a thicker barrier in the vertical position as you went up the tower?
It would have been an ideal way of doing it, but the same thickness was ordered all the way up. So it covered every eventuality, and it was cut down basically by the fitters on site.
I see. So does that mean at the lower levels the barrier would have been cut down because the gap was smaller?
Exactly.
I see. But at the higher levels it wouldn't fit that
be
gap.
cut so much. No.
Okay, that's helpful. And the trimming to site, was that something that Osborne Berry would do, trimming to site, on site?
Yes.
And would that be subject to instructions from Harley or supervision from Harley?
No, you just do that naturally.
Yeah. But there was no reference back to the Siderise installation guidance when you were doing that trimming?
No.
At the time, did you generally understand that the purpose of cavity barriers within rain screen systems was to inhibit the passage of fire from window openings into cavities and then to inhibit the spread of fire within those cavities?
I knew that you compartmentalized it,
Yeah.
but I didn't know that fire breaks had to go down the edges of windows
Okay.
or at the bottom of windows at the time.
Yeah. Does that mean that you, at the time, understood that they were needed in the external wall
I did.
to stop fire spreading
Travelling
up
from
that
one
external wall
to-
cavity?
Yeah, I did.
And did you understand what the consequences might be of poorly fitting cavity barriers, for example, if there were gaps in the system?
I did.
And did you understand this might affect the performance of those barriers in the event of fire?
I did.
Did you take any steps to ensure that all of the Osborne Berry fitters working on the Grenfell project understood that?
I told them enough times, yes.
Did you have to remind them to
I reminded a few of them.
Sorry.
I reminded a few of them, yes.
And what did you say to them?
Just make sure it's neat and tidy. Make sure it fits properly.
Yeah.
But they were a good bunch of fitters, basically.
Okay. Now, when Ben Bailey gave his oral evidence, I don't think we need to pull this up. This is at day 40, page 138, line 7. He was asked whether he gave any instructions or guidance to Osborne Berry about the materials to be used or fire safety. And he said, other than the cavity barriers being an important part of that, I don't recall any specific conversations about topics. Now, so he seems to be indicating that there might have been a conversation about cavity barriers being an important part of the system. Do you recall having that conversation?
I don't remember the conversation, but with Ben, it wouldn't surprise me if he said that, because he is very, very thorough on things like that.
Yeah. Did Harley give you any guidance in respect of the cavity barrier installation in terms of fire safety?
No.
Did Harley ever provide any specific instructions about which type of cavity barriers should be used in which location?
We basically knew by what cavity barriers we had, what went where. They were all kept separately. This was for horizontal and this was for vertical. They were stored in different places, basically. So nobody could make that mistake.
I see. Now, let's look at some pictures of the installation contained in Dr. Barbara Lane's Phase 1 report. If we can turn first to BLAS 608, page 48. And if we can zoom in on that photograph. So this is a Siderise RH25 cavity barrier. And we can see that she's zoomed in on that part of the tape, the green tape on the side of the barrier. And we can see that this is an RH cavity barrier, a horizontal cavity barrier, installed in the vertical position. Do you agree?
I do.
And do you agree that that's not correct?
I do agree it's not correct.
Can you explain how this might have happened, horizontal installed in the vertical position?
I can't answer that question. It's bugged me for a long time, the question about that, because I'd looked at these things in various locations many times, but I never, ever saw that.
So you can't help us as to why that wasn't picked up by Osborne Berry during its supervision and checking of its work?
I can't, I'm afraid.
And if you'd seen this, would you have thought that that installation was acceptable and in accordance with Harley's instructions?
No, it would have been pulled out and redone.
Did you ever see any instances of horizontal cavity barriers used in the vertical position when you were
Not at all.
on site?
Not at all.
So you didn't tell anyone to pull it out and redo it?
Never had this problem at all.
Now, when Dr. Lane and her team went to visit the site after the fire, they found in their inspections that there were no proper full-fill vertical cavity barriers on site. Instead, the vertical cavity barriers all appeared to be the RH25 horizontal product intended for horizontal installation. Can you help us as to why no full-fill vertical barriers were found on site after the fire?
I can't, because they would definitely, that's something I know, that they would definitely use the full-fill barrier, because the depth of the barrier is much bigger than what the RH25 system is. So it's a wider barrier.
Right. The BRE have also reported for the Met Police that they found the same thing. So for the transcript, that's at MET 3039807 at page 52, paragraph 73. Did you ever see vertical cavity barriers, properly so called, i.e. full-fill barriers, actually on site?
I did.
And I think you said you thought they were kept in a different
They were kept in a different location, yeah.
So you can't help us as to why they don't seem to have been installed?
I can't. I'm shocked that they weren't installed.
We've looked at some of the purchase orders, and it does appear that the vertical products were ordered from Siderise. If we just look at HAR 50484, we might need to go to the native version of this. Can we get the native version up? No, okay. The native version does clearly show, you can take it from me, that this Harley purchase order dated the 6th of October 2015 shows RVG vertical cavity barriers being in the purchase order from Cider Eyes. So they do appear to have been ordered, but you can't help us as to why we can't find those products on the tower.
As far as I'm aware, they were on the tower because I fitted some of them myself.
I see.
And I know they were on site because I unloaded them off the lorry.
Yeah, okay. Now, going back to the photo we were looking at, this is BLAS 608 at page 48. We can see that here we've also got the intermittent strip facing into the building. That's right, isn't it?
Correct, yes.
Because the intermittent strip is down the side where the green tape is.
That's correct.
So is it right that this installation is also wrong in another respect? Not only has it been used in the wrong orientation, but whoever's installing it has also put the intermittent strip on the inside of the building?
That is correct.
And again, can you help us as to how that might have occurred?
I can't.
To your knowledge, were installers given clear guidance about where the intermittent strip was located and how to position the barrier so that it faced outwards and into the cavity?
Most definitely.
And did you ever see this on site?
No, as you've probably heard from BJ, it's very hard to see that once the insulation has gone on the column, holding the fire break in place, because it would be covered over by 100 mil of insulation.
Yeah, I see.
And that would hide it from your view.
And when you say heard from BJ, who do you mean by BJ?
Ben Bailey.
Ben Bailey, I see. And is that because in practice, on the same day that you would install this cavity barrier, the insulation would be applied over the top?
Correct. Otherwise, the cavity barriers, a wind would get up and just blow them straight off the building instantly.
Yeah.
So the cavity barriers have to go on. Then the insulation up alongside them to hold them in place.
So does that mean that for each cavity barrier there would only be a small window of time to notice, for someone to notice that that was in the wrong position or the wrong orientation?
Exactly.
Now, did you understand at the time of the install that the horizontal cavity barriers must fit tightly and precisely at their edges in order for them to be effective in a fire?
I did.
Can we look at another one of Dr. Lane's photos? This is BLAS 608 at 45. So this is figure 8.49 of her phase 1 report. And what we can see here, she's pulled off a section of cavity barrier and she's highlighting that it's got very roughly cut edges. Do you see that?
I do.
And then if we go over the page from 45 to 46 and to figure 8.50, yeah. Here what she's giving, perhaps if we go to the top photo first and zoom in on that. She's explained that there's poorly fitting edges of those cavity barriers, both of the back edge and the side edges. Yes. Do you agree?
I would agree.
And also that the intermittent strip on the top left-hand side has started to come away from the cavity barrier.
I can see that as well.
Where one of the rails has cut into it.
Yeah.
Again, would you agree that both of those are examples of poor workmanship?
Most definitely.
Did you ever see similar workmanship on site?
Not at all.
And had you seen it, what would you have done?
I would have ripped it off and redone it.
Yeah.
Or
And-
probably at the time I'd have got the fitters who did it to rip it off and redo it.
Yeah. And then if we look at the photograph underneath, again, we can see she's highlighted a poorly fitting join between the two cavity barriers in this location. I think we can see this is on the columns because we can see the little indentations into the concrete at the bottom. So she's highlighting a poorly fitting join, but she's also highlighting, look, that there we've got the intermittent edge facing into the other cavity barrier.
I have noticed that.
Do you see
as well.
that?
Yes.
Again, would you agree that these are examples of poor workmanship?
That's not good.
And had you seen that kind of installation?
That would have been taken out and redone.
And then if we can go to another photograph on page 44, staying with this document, figure 8.48. So at the bottom of that page, here we can see the top. We're looking down at the top of the cavity barrier, and we can see one panel of insulation on the top. Some others been pulled off.
Yeah.
And can you see she's highlighted there in the middle label a break in the cavity barrier at the location of the cladding rails?
I can.
And so what we see is that the horizontal cavity barrier was regularly interrupted over the length of the spandrel on every level by those rails.
Correct.
Now, did you ever notice that on site?
Yes, that's the only way you would have got the rails on.
Yeah.
Had to cut into the cavity barrier.
Did you ever discuss with anybody whether that might compromise the operation of the cavity barriers in that location and therefore need some kind of remedial solution?
Not that I can remember. I remember asking somebody about it and was told you've got to cut into it to put them on, and that's all I can remember.
Yeah. Is it your evidence, therefore, that that was how it was designed to be, not, and that
Correct.
this isn't an example of poor
No,
workmanship?
that's how it was designed to be.
Yeah,
That's the only way you get the cladding rail down.
yeah. Can we look at another document now? I referred earlier to the fact there was a BRE investigation after the fire for the Met Police. I just want to look at one of their reports. This is MET 3039807. So this is a BRE report. It's dated the 20th of February 2019, and essentially it sets out their findings from their site investigation work at the tower. And if we go within it to page 55, and if we look at top figure first, figure 37, can you see there that we've got the cavity barrier cut around the Rainabond panel on the column? Again, did you see instances of that on site?
That picture's not telling the full tale.
Right.
There should be a cladding rail going down inside there.
Right, I see.
Because if you see, and you notice at the top, there's a bracket on the top underneath the window.
Yes?
Now, at the centre of that bracket would be a cladding rail, which would shoot straight down that gap.
Yeah,
That's why that gap's cut there.
I see. So what might have happened is someone's removed the cladding rail and that's the gap that's created.
Yes, exactly.
Fair enough, I understand. And then look at figure 38 below. Can you see there what they're highlighting next to the cladding rail is a gap where the cavity barrier doesn't go right
Yes,
up to the
I can see that.
Would you accept that that's
That's
an example
been
of
cut
poor
wrong.
workmanship?
That's poor workmanship, yes.
So you agree that's poor
That
workmanship?
should have been tighter. That should have been touching the aluminium of the channel that holds the panel.
Yeah. So it should have been tightly fitted.
Yeah, it should have.
Now, Mr. Ben Bailey, in his witness statement, refers to various images from Dr. Lane's report, her Phase 1 report, And his evidence was that he was very shocked when he saw Dr. Lane's photographs. For the transcript, that's at paragraph 32 of HAR 30010060 at page 10. Do you agree that the photographs we've seen from Dr. Lane's report are shocking?
I do.
And that work was unacceptable?
It certainly was.
And it was obviously work not carried out with reasonable skill and care?
That's correct.
Mr. Bailey also says, through observations on site or when I conducted my checks, I never saw workmanship like this. If I had, I would have immediately raised this with TAF and or Bears of Osborne Berry to rectify. Can you help us as to why Mr. Ben Bailey says he didn't see cavity barriers installed in the manner we've just discussed?
It's exactly the same as I never saw them. You couldn't see everything on the building before it was covered, basically. It would even be hard for building control or clerk of the works to see some of these things.
Because they were being covered up so quickly with insulation?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did it never occur to anybody that it might be important to perhaps pause the work or have some kind of system in place for checking those cavity barriers before the insulation went on?
It would. If this was done off a scaffold, it would be a far easier project to manage.
Yeah.
Because you could get to every level whenever you wanted to. It would also be protected from the weather, because the actual scaffold would be sheeted over in some respect or form. On a mast climber, it takes you from bottom of building to top of the building, 20 minutes to get up and 20 minutes to come down.
Yeah.
You just couldn't be in every place. You couldn't keep an eye on everything that was going on. It would be an impossibility. You know, even if you had somebody down on the floor with binoculars, you'd never see all of it.
Yeah.
It would have been better done, as I say, off a scaffold. Or, like you said, stop the job and check everything as it goes on the building.
Yeah. The use of mast climbers, was that common practice in your experience of installing these facades, or would a scaffold have been the norm?
No, it is common practice to use a mast climber. These mast climbers, to me, were unusual, that there was 8 of them. Normally there would have only been 4.
Right.
Which is also a lot easier to keep the building under control.
So you did have 2 mast climbers per face?
Per face.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cavity barriers around the windows. At the time you were working on the Grenfell project, were you aware that there was extensive industry guidance, including in something called Approved Document B on fire safety, which indicated that cavity barriers had to be installed around window openings in order to comply with the building regulations?
I was not aware of this, no.
Had you ever heard of Approved Document B on fire safety?
I haven't.
Had you ever looked at something called Diagram 33 out of that?
Not at all.
No. Had you ever installed cavity barriers around window openings on other buildings that you'd worked on?
Not that I can remember.
So in other rain screen systems that you installed, is it your evidence that in none of those projects were you installing cavity barriers around the windows?
Correct.
Did you notice, did it strike you at the time as something that was noteworthy that there were no cavity barriers around the windows at the Grenfell project?
Not at all.
And why? Can you help us as to why that wouldn't have been something that stuck out for you?
Because of the compartmentalising, I assumed that cavity barriers weren't required around window frames.
Is that because you could see there was a system of putting
A square around a flat, basically.
Yeah. I see. Did you ever have any conversations with anybody on the Grenfell project about the lack of cavity barriers around windows?
I did not.
So if we can just look at Mr. Gary Martin's evidence, this is one of the Ryden employees. If we can go to the transcript on day 30, and I want to look at page 19. And if we pick it up at line 2, he's asked, were you aware that cavity barriers had to be provided to close the edges of cavities, including around openings? And then he says, yes, but if you're talking about windows specifically, there was a barrier, a foil and tape barrier placed around the whole window opening. And when I thought about it, it should be a fire barrier or shouldn't be a fire barrier. I checked with the drawings and asked, and I can't remember who I asked, but the comment back was that there was vertical and horizontal fire barriers continuing the compartment out through to the exterior cladding. And I say, I see. And then the question, so they weren't required around the window. Were you specifically told that they weren't required? Yes. Around the window? Yeah. Can you recall who might have told you that? I don't recall, but it prompted me to look at the drawings, and there was nothing on the drawings to suggest that they should be. And if we can keep going over the page. Do you think it was somebody at Ryden that you would have spoken to? I honestly can't remember. Is it possible that you spoke to someone outside Ryden about that question? It would have been 3 people, probably Taff from Harley's. It would have been probably Dave Hughes. It could have been Jason North, or it would have been the Clerk of Works. It would have been one of those people. Now, can you help us as to whether you might have ever had any conversations with Gary Martin about cavity barriers, whether they were required around windows, whether it was sufficient to have them around the compartment, as you've just referred to? Can you recall of that?
I did not have a conversation, as I can remember, with Mr. Martin
You never had a conversation with
in
Mr.
regards
Martin?
with cavity barriers.
I see, yeah. Now, I just want to ask you about the positioning of cavity barriers and how you measured where they should be. And I want to start by just looking at something in Ben Bailey's evidence. If we look at day 40, page 187. And if we go to lines 22 and following at the bottom of that page, he's asked the question, did you ever measure the position of the cavity barriers as installed, so far as you did inspect them, against the drawings to make sure that the as installed distances above the windows complied with the drawings? And if we go over the page, and then he says, answer, I'm unsure of a specific time that they were measured. And then he said, the question, I'm not sure I understand that answer. And he gives the answer back. Let me ask the question again. During any of your inspections of the work or workmanship of the installation of the facade, did you ever measure the position of the horizontal cavity barriers above the windows as installed by Osborne Berry against the drawings that you had? I don't recall. Now, can you help us as to whether you actually were measuring specifically where the horizontal cavity barriers were to go above
Yes,
the window?
We made a timber block that fitted onto the head angle of the window below,
Yep.
and that was the position that the cavity barriers went off the sample panel
Yep.
on the 16th floor. So they were all set up the same as what that template panel was, because that template panel was what everything worked off, basically.
And was it during the time you were working on that template panel that you identified the fact that you didn't want to cut
It
into
was
the
before-
EDPM?
Yes, exactly. That template panel was done so the architects, the main contractor, Rydens, Harley, everybody could come and look at it and say they agreed to where everything was before we started fitting the fire breaks.
And therefore that template panel showed the cavity barrier higher than
It
had
did.
been on the Harley drawings.
It did. And if you look back in the paperwork from OBI to Harley, we actually charge somewhere for doing that template sample panel.
Right.
So
yeah.
you will have a date of exactly when that was actually done.
That's helpful, thank you. Let's just have a look at a photograph on this. This is HAR 401524. And so here we can see, is it right that what we can see horizontally are cavity barriers?
Correct.
going through the insulation with the Rainabond panels next to them that are labelled.
Correct.
And so in these photographs, we get a sense, I think, is that right, of how high above the windows those cavity barriers were. Would you
do.
agree?
I do.
Yeah. And so we can see there that they are further away from the windows than allowed for in the drawings.
It's correct.
Yeah, thank you. Now, just before leaving cavity barriers, I want to turn to another email. This is CEL 408582. And I want to start by looking at the bottom email on the first page, which is an email from Mr. Anquetil Jones. This is the 12th of July 2013, and it's about a different project. It's the ISIS House project, and the subject of the email is ISIS House firebreak visit. And it's from Mr. Anquetil Jones to Jonathan Room. And at this point, he was working at a company called Hilti. And Mr. Anquetil Jones writes, and you can see at the bottom of that page, he says, John Taff, brackets Mark Osborne, and if we can read on to the top of the next page, needs some help on site with the installation of fire breaks to make sure it's being done right and discuss and resolve any problems he may be having. Thanks. Kind regards, Daniel. Now, do you recall speaking to Mr. Room or anyone else about the installation of fire breaks at ISIS House?
Off the top of my head, no.
Okay.
But it wouldn't surprise me because that was a curtain wall system
Yes.
with very, very heavy panels. I can't remember it off the top of my head, no.
Okay. So you can't help us as to what assistance you might have got in terms of
Not at all.
installation of fire breaks?
Not at all.
And do you know why Mr. Anquetil Jones might have been contacting Mr. Room for such guidance while he was working at Hilti?
I don't. That I can't answer.
Did you know of an individual called Jonathan Room?
That's the name that doesn't ring a bell.
Okay. Fine. The installation of the windows, I want to ask you a few questions about those. Mr. Chairman, this is another topic. It will probably take me more than 5 minutes, so I'm happy to break now if that's easier, or I'm happy to carry on and break after this topic.
How much longer do you think you're going to want?
In general?
In general, yes.
Probably between half an hour and 40 minutes. So.
Well, we either want to break now or after this topic, don't we? How
Yeah.
long did you say? 5 minutes?
Yeah, it's 4 pages of notes, so it's more than a few minutes.
All right. Should we break now?
Yeah.
Right. Mr. Osborne, we're going to have a break now in the middle of the afternoon. We'll come back and resume at 3:30, please. And please don't talk to anyone
That's fine.
while you're out of the room about your evidence or anything relating to it. Okay? Right. Would you like to give the usher then, please? Right.
Thank you.
3:30, please. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Mr. Osborne to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Osborne?
I'm fine, thank
Ready
you.
to keep going, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, Ms. Grange?
Yes, just a few questions now about the windows. And I want to look at a couple of drawings to start with. If we can look at, first of all, SEA 403040 at page 7. So this is a drawing that was stamped by Studio E Architects as category A conforms to design intent. We can see there that was added on the 16th of January 2015. And it's a window jamb detailed drawing. Do you see that?
I do.
And it's looking at where the windows meet the columns. And what I want to do is then show that, and we can see this drawing is marked approved for construction on the bottom right. And if we can show side by side with that drawing, a similar drawing. This is HAR 3010440. And what we're getting on the right-hand side is effectively the same basic drawing. We don't have a Studio E stamp on this, but there are some key changes as between the two. Perhaps we can then pull up the second drawing, make that big on the page, and just look at that. They both have the same drawing number, but if we can zoom in to this drawing, when Mr. Lamb gave his evidence to the inquiry, at paragraph 31 of his witness statement, he explained that there were some differences between the stamped version, the Studio E stamped version, and this version. The stamped version had shown local fixing straps that were to be installed behind the window frame, and this was removed on this unstamped drawing in order to reflect things as they had been built. And then this unstamped drawing doesn't show local fixing straps, but instead a layer of adhesive foam in the cavity between the window frame and the EDPM membrane. So if we look right in the centre, we see a grey area with a label adhesive foam, and that's immediately in front of the EDPM membrane, which I think is shown with a black dotted line. Do you agree?
I do.
And we just wanted to ask you a little bit about this window detailing. Can you tell us, was it the first version of the drawing or this version of the drawing with adhesive foam that was actually built on site?
It was this version of the drawing,
Yeah.
but I don't remember putting adhesive foam
Right.
down the joint.
That was my next question. So whether or not it was Osborne Berry that installed the layer of foam in the cavity between the window frame and the EDPM membrane. Can you help us on that?
No, it definitely wasn't Osborne and Berry as far as I'm aware.
No. Okay. Now, if we look at page 9 of your second witness statement, this is OSB 6090, page 9, and look at paragraph 16D, in the middle of that page, you're asked, describe precisely where fire foaming was applied by Osborne Berry, and you say Osborne Berry applied fire foam to the exterior window frame and insulation. Can you help us there as to where exactly fire foam was applied in relation to the windows, insulation, or other parts of the external facade of the building?
In respect to fire foam, it was put in to hold the windows in place because they weren't actually screwed in.
Right.
The windows fitted on a double angle system where the top bead was 25 mil deep on the bottom of the angle and the bottom bead was 15 mil deep. She lifted it up and dropped it down,
Yep.
and then packed it to suit, and fire foam was used all around the perimeter of that to hold the
Right.
window to the bead.
Okay. So you're talking about fire foam around the edge of that window?
The top and the bottom,
Yeah.
not the jambs.
You're not talking about down the jambs? Okay, that's really helpful. Who asked Osborne Berry to apply that foam around the window frame?
That would be Ray from Harley, I believe.
Right. Do you know whether that instruction was reflected in any of the drawings?
I cannot remember.
Can you recall whether anyone discussed the fire performance of that foam?
Not with me, no.
Okay.
All I can tell you is it definitely had fire foam written on the can.
Now, with reference back to the drawings we were looking at and that jam position, because the windows were positioned, the new windows, outside and forward of the original concrete line of the building, it's right, isn't it, that there was a gap down the side of the windows?
That's correct.
Which varied in its dimensions. Is that right?
That's correct.
The inquiry experts have put that as between 35 and 90 millimetres, that gap. Sorry, I beg your pardon. In the Harley drawings, it's marked as between 35 and 90 millimetres, but Dr. Lane measured that gap as between 30 and 120 millimetres, as a bigger gap. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with Dr. Lane 100%.
Yeah. Did you ever consider, given that gap, whether there ought to be some form of fire barrier at the window jambs, and in particular between the EDPM membrane and the insulation in the column cavity?
Well, I would have thought plasterboard would have been put on the inside to stop the fire spread.
Right, I see. So your expectation was it that there would be a plasterboard lining on the
Inside.
window interior reveals?
That's correct.
Yeah. That's helpful. Well, we're going to be exploring that with Mr. Dixon tomorrow. But you never, is it right, you never had any discussions about the vulnerability that was created by that gap?
Not at all.
No. So supervision and training now. I want to ask you some questions about the supervision of fitters. And it's right, isn't it, that Osborne Berry used self-employed fitters throughout the installation process?
Correct.
Now, we saw from the method statement, let's just pull that back up. This is HAR 30010913. This is the method statement which I think you said you didn't look at the time, or don't remember considering. We know you're described as the site foreman. Was that throughout the installation works you were the site foreman?
Yes, I got that task, I'm afraid.
And does that mean that you undertook the bulk of the supervision of Osborne Berry's fitters?
No, Graham and I both
Right.
looked after the job.
And how did you divide that between you?
Basically, whichever face we were working on, we'd do the one to the opposite side of us. So we'd look after two faces. So if you were working on the west, you'd look after the south. If you
Yeah.
were working on the north, you'd look after the east. And
Right.
various as we went around the building.
I see. Now, on page 3 of this document, in the very last paragraph, if we can go to that, it says all operatives should read and understand the method statement and risk assessment before carrying out the works. If an operative is unsure of the requirements, then they should ask their line manager or site manager. Now, I appreciate you say you didn't see this particular method statement, but did Osborne Berry provide its operatives with the method statements that were given to them by Harley on the job?
I don't think we actually gave them the method statement. We just told them how we'd want it done from the method statement.
I see. Did any fitters ever say to you that they were unsure about how to fit any part of the cladding system?
Not that I can remember, but there again, most of them worked with me for quite a while before they went on to do it on their own.
Right.
So they'd already had a fairly good briefing into how to do it.
And were you satisfied that all the labourers were able to fully understand the work that had been tasked to them?
Yes.
Did these fitters have access to members of Harley or Ryden in order to receive any assistance and advice if needed?
If they needed to, yes.
Both Harley and Ryden
They could have spoken
were
to
there
any
for
of them, yeah.
And then at page 7 of your first witness statement, for the for the transcript, this is paragraph 11, you say that on-site training was provided to those who were employed to assist Osborne Berry in the installation process. Can you help us as to what type of on-site training was provided to those who were involved?
Basically, I just showed them how to do it.
So you would
I'd set it
physically
all
do
up
it
and
in
make
front?
one physically and do the actual job that they were meant to do and stay with them for a while till they got used to it. So they'd probably work on the same mast climber as me for a week or so.
Yeah.
One working to the left, one working to the right. So they just follow what I was doing, basically.
Yeah. And would they be provided with any separate information about how to do it, such as from the drawings or any other
Drawings would be
guidance?
available if they wanted them, yes.
Do you think the fitters would have referred back to the drawings, or is that unlikely?
I think some of them referred back to the drawings.
Right.
And can you tell us how many fitters did you have? A maximum number?
Right at the end, 14.
14?
Yeah,
And did the numbers build up over a period of time?
they did, yes, they did. We started off with 3 doing the measurement work, then it went to 2 doing all the drilling, and then it just built up from there to 6 to 8, and then at the end it built up to 14, basically.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, within this method statement on page 1, if we look in the third paragraph in the second sentence, it says that all operatives undertaking manual work will hold a relevant CSCS card. We'll come to that in a moment. And then they say Harley will ensure that regular toolbox talks are carried out with training provided where necessary. Were you ever aware of something called toolbox talks being carried out?
I was not aware of any toolbox talks on the job, no.
So you don't think any fitters did have the benefit of toolbox talks?
Not that I can remember.
And the reference there to they're holding a valid CS card, can you help us as to what that was referring to?
That's the card that allows us to work on a building site in England, basically.
Yeah.
And if you need references to the cards, I believe Rydens would have that.
Right, yeah. Now, turning to page 6 of your second witness statement, if we look at that, this is OSB 6090 at page 6. And then at the very bottom of the page, you say it was you and Mr. Berry who supervised the installation. And then over the page, if we go over the page, it says, how was this supervision conducted? And it just says, by verbal communications on site. And you've said thereafter that Osborne Berry did not keep any written documentation of the supervision. However, Osborne Berry reported to Harley by verbal communications the progress of the refurbishment. Now, just pausing there, were these fitters supervised by Osborne Berry on a daily basis?
Yes and no. If they had problems, they'd phone us up and ask us to come and have a look, but we weren't with them all the time, because obviously 8 mast climbers, there is a lot of places on the building, so
Yeah.
not on a daily basis, no.
How frequently were you or Mr. Berry on site during the period of the works?
Me, the whole job, from start to finish. Mr. Berry, I would say between half and 3/4 of the job.
Were any records kept of the supervision and the results of that supervision?
I'm afraid not.
What about photographs? Would you accept that it would be common practice, good practice, for an installer to take photographs of the installation as it progressed, in particular so that you could show that to anybody who was needing to see what was underneath, for example, the insulation?
In hindsight now, yes. And I take so many photographs, my phone can't keep up with them. But that is in hindsight of Grenfell Tower.
Does that mean that at the time of the Grenfell project you weren't taking photographs of the
I
installation?
wasn't very well up with that. I believe my business partner might be able to supply you some photographs that he took on his phone or were passed to Rydens. But I can't verify that.
I see. But you didn't have at the time a formal system of regularly taking photographs,
No.
so you could hand those over to relevant inspectors, including building control inspectors.
No.
Were you satisfied that a consistent approach was taken to supervision on the project?
I was, yes.
Now, if we look at page 7 of your first witness statement, OSB 6087, page 7, you say at paragraph 12, you say there, so you're asked to what extent did Osborne Berry supervise the work of those installing? And you say this was done to the best of our abilities, but with 8 mast climbers working on this process, it was not possible to check every individual item installed by the people we were employed to assist us. So can you help us as to how much of the work of the individual installers would probably not be checked on site? I mean, how frequently would you and Mr. Berry go up on the mast climbers and check an individual fitter's work?
It's hard to say. Some fitters would get checked more than others, but some fitters probably wouldn't get checked for a week on, basically.
Right.
Because we knew them and trusted them, basically.
I see.
The ones I checked most of all were the ones we had from agencies.
Yeah.
We used agency fitters, and I wasn't sure of those, so they got more checks than our
Yeah.
regular fitters that had worked on Little Venice with us and Commercial Road.
And on the job, I think you've just explained that there were perhaps up to 14 fitters by the end. What proportion of those were agency versus your regular fitters?
I think there was 3 teams of agency fitters.
Yeah,
That would be fitter and mate, basically.
right, yeah. Now, if we can look at a document HAR 30s11476. This is a document authored by Harley and appears to be a rescue plan to be communicated in the form of a toolbox talk by the site manager or London hoist contract supervisor. Do you see that there?
I do.
It said in the event of a machine breaking down at height or any injury, follow the following rescue plan. And you are there as the site manager. Do you see
Precisely.
that?
I've just been promoted. That changed to suit people, I think.
I see. So did you ever think of yourself as the site manager on the job?
Not at all.
No. Can you explain as to why this says you were the site manager?
I have not got a clue.
But in practice, did you consider that you and Mr. Berry were there, at least in part, to supervise the work and inspect the work of the fitters to make sure it had been done correctly?
We were there to make sure they did the good quality of work,
Yeah.
yes.
In Mr. Ben Bailey's witness statement, he says at paragraph 13, for the transcript, that's HAR 30s10060 at page 5, he says, I believe that Taff and Bez were also inspecting the work, as I remember asking them at various points, and they would confirm that they were. Do you agree with that,
I do.
you did confirm to Mr. Bailey that you were
We did
inspecting
look
the
at
work?
Yeah.
Do you agree, and was this your understanding at the time, that Harley was relying on Osborne Berry to inspect and check the work carried out by the fitters?
Not to inspect it, to make sure it was done to a standard,
Right.
but not to fully inspect the work now.
And Mr. Osgood, when he gave evidence, this for the transcript, this was at day 30, page 132, line 12, he was asked whether Harley was inspecting the work and whether Osborne Berry were checking their own work, and he replied, yes, absolutely, we wouldn't inspect until they had done that. And he was asked who was doing that, and he said Taff being the lead fixer. Again, would you agree with that you were inspecting before Mr. Osgood?
I made sure I went round and made sure everything was sealed and properly done before he looked at it, yes. But most of it was just a visual check.
Later on in that transcript, at page 142, line 15, Mr. Osgood was asked what checks he actually carried out, and he answered, again, we had a specification and we went through that, both myself, Taff, and we checked everything as far as I am aware. Was it your practice when you were checking what your fitters had done to go back to the specification and the drawings and to check it?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So what were you inspecting for or checking for?
I just made sure everything looked neat and tidy, basically, and that everything was uniform.
Yeah. In the position statement, we looked at it earlier, your Osborne Berry's position statement, you'd set out 11 different stages of the installation process. Can you help us as to whether Osborne Berry would inspect the work carried out by the fitters at each of those 11 stages? Do you want to have a look at that? It's OSB 7084, and it's paragraph 8, and it goes from pages 1 through to page 2. So at the bottom of that page, there's a summary of the installation process. And then the different stages are set out, and it goes on to page 2. Can you help us as to whether there would have been a check by Osborne Berry at each of those stages? Is that how it was structured?
There would definitely be one for the shelf angles and the EPDM and the windows. And that would probably entail the brackets being on at the same time.
But would there be some of these stages where you wouldn't check at the end of the stage?
There most definitely would. You wouldn't have checked every single thing.
Okay.
Most of the holes that you've got down there, vertical concrete columns, most of the drilling, that was pre-checked, and it was checked by an outside company to make sure that the pull-out tests were correct and up to standard, basically.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you some questions about... Sorry, just before I do that, and we leave this topic, did you have any feedback mechanisms where you had given feedback to a fitter, say you weren't happy with something? Did you have any formal mechanism in place to make sure any workmanship issues identified were remedied and not repeated?
I did, and as I said earlier, I'd go and check that particular fitter more than I checked any other fitters, basically.
I see. So if you were giving feedback and you weren't happy with the work, you would just increase the frequency with which the work was checked?
Checked, yeah.
Would you ever formally record in a diary or a document?
I probably did in my diary.
I see. Okay. Now, inspections by others now, and starting with Harley. Paragraph 4 of Mr. Ben Bailey's witness statement, if we just bring this up, this is at HAR 30010060 at page 4. And I want to look at the very top of that page. It's within paragraph 11. And he says this: I never spoke with the fixer installers directly about work issues, but would speak regularly with TAF and BES about all elements of the installation, including cavity barriers. I would ask them if they were happy with the installation and how it was coming along. They always reported back to me that everything was okay, save for the usual day-to-day site issues, none of which related to fire safety. Do you see that there?
I do.
Now, do you agree with what Ben Bailey said there about, first of all, that he would speak regularly with you about all elements, including the cavity barriers?
He would speak about various things at different times he arrived. I can't remember if it was specifically cavity barriers. Whether he spoke to the fixers or not, I couldn't answer that question. I don't know.
Yeah.
But he would ask us how we were progressing, yes.
Yeah. Later in that paragraph, he says, I would monitor the overall progress being made in order to keep the work on schedule. Whilst I attended site about 2 to 3 times a week, depending on what was going on, I would not go up the mass climbers each time. I was there as this would disrupt the work of the installers. Now, is it your recollection that Mr. Ben Bailey would be attending site 2 to 3 times a week?
Not in the beginning, but at the end, yes, definitely. And he would go up in the mass climbers because he'd normally go up after the installers had gone home.
Right, I see.
As I was aware.
And you're drawing a distinction between what he did at the beginning and what he did by the end. Can you recall what it was that resulted in him coming more frequently?
I think he was asked to by Rydens.
Right. And would Ben Bailey deal with any issues that were arising on site relating to the installation?
Yes.
Did he ever discuss any problems with the quality of the installation with you?
Not at all.
How did Harley inform Osborne Berry of any snagging issues with the cladding installation?
There was some paperwork. Ben would raise a form with and identify with pictures various things that he wanted rectified.
Yeah,
That's as I remember it.
I see. And how did you make sure that each of those was resolved?
Well, either myself or one of the lead fitters would go round and resolve the problems, basically, and then Mr. Bailey would go and check it again.
Yeah. Now, in his oral evidence to the inquiry, Ben Bailey recalled that he performed visual checks of levels 1 to 20 on the north, west and east elevations. Can you recall him undertaking those kind of inspections?
Yes, yes.
But in terms of the south elevation, it would appear that he didn't check the south elevation. Is that your recollection?
That I can't answer that. I do not know. But I would have assumed he checked the south as well.
I see. But do you have any memory?
I haven't any memory now.
Yeah. Ryden now. Were Ryden also inspecting Osborne Berry's work so far as you were aware?
I believed that the building control and Ryden's checked over the work, yes.
At the same time, would building control and
I think
Ryden?
building control went
inspect?
with Ryden's, if I remember correctly.
I see. Were you conscious of any other more frequent inspections by Ryden?
No, not really.
When the work was inspected by Ryden, was that as it proceeded, stage by stage, or only after the exterior ACM was in place?
As it proceeded through the job.
I see. And were you or Mr. Berry always present during Ryden inspections?
Not at all, as I can remember.
And can you remember any particular individuals at Ryden that would actually inspect your work?
I can't.
Okay.
Sorry.
Can you recall any problems being highlighted by Ryden about the quality of the installation?
Not at all.
Was there any formal process for signing off portions of Osborne Berry's work by Ryden?
You'd have to speak to BJ because he dealt with all that signing off paperwork.
I see. And again,
Correctly.
you're referring to the evidence of Ben Bailey there?
Yeah.
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 If we could look at a document, this is RYD 51861. This is a defects list for Grenfell Tower. It's authored by, it's a Ryden generated document. Do you recall ever receiving documents like this?
I have seen the documents like this before.
On the Grenfell project?
On the Grenfell project, yes.
So you think you did see them?
Yes.
I mean, item 21, for example, says scratches to glass. That would be something for Osborne Berry to address, would it?
It would.
And so can you recall being provided with defects lists like this and then remedying them?
I can.
Yeah. So when Mr. Hughes, David Hughes of Ryden, gave evidence on day 27, this is page 86, perhaps if we can just pull this up. So it's day 27, page 86, and I want to look at line 16. So if we start with the question he's asked at line 16, he's asked, did you identify any defects or issues with the cladding prior to this building control visit? And he says, no, not with the cladding, but I go back to what I told you earlier. One thing I did notice, that the gaps, the joins on the insulation boards weren't taped. I asked Taff and Bez this question, and they said that they didn't need to. And that's when I went back and referred to the Celotex, or had a look at the Celotex brochure to see if I could see anywhere specifically it said that the joins had to be taped. You see that there? And then,
I
he
do.
says, and I'm talking, if we can go on, about the joins between insulation boards. Yes.
As far as I was aware, all joints in insulation board, all fixings, were taped over. That would be something that BJ would have checked and inspected and pulled us up on,
Yeah,
because that was a must
yeah,
to stop dampness or moisture getting into the system.
I see. And just to be clear, when you're talking about the joints, that was
Where two
how the
boards
boards
butt together
come
like that,
together.
straight across the flat joint.
And did anyone ever raise with you the question of whether the edges, the exposed edges of the insulation boards, also ought to be taped?
No, not at all, but I have something to say on that. If you buy a product that all edges are taped when it arrives with you,
Yeah,
you would naturally assume if you cut it, you have to retape the edge.
right.
These come with 4 open edges.
Yeah,
So you never assume you have to tape it.
I see.
And no paperwork was provided to tell us to tape it.
yeah. Did you yourself ever look at the Celotex rain screen cladding guide, the document that Mr. Hughes says he looked at?
No,
No. So you didn't ever
No.
check what that said in terms of taping of joints?
I didn't. I trusted Dave, and if Dave said some had been missed, then I would have gone out and redone the taping and told the fitters who were doing it that they meant to tape the joints, basically.
When we looked at the Harley method statement earlier, I read out to you there was a bit, it was item 10 of that statement on the column cladding. It said taping joints with Class O adhesive foil tape. Do you remember that?
I do.
Now, did you ever discuss with anybody why the joints in the insulation boards were taped, but the edges were not?
I did not.
And when you saw a Class Naught adhesive foil tape, did you think the Class Naught was relevant to its fire performance?
I did.
Have you ever worked on a project where the edges of such insulation board are taped?
They still aren't being taped to this day.
Yeah. When Mr. Hughes gave evidence, it was slightly unclear, but at one point it seemed that he thought that there hadn't been taping of insulation joints. As far as you're concerned, was that work actually carried out?
Most definitely. One answer to that one, building control would have picked it up, and so should the clerk of the works, and so should BJ, because it would have been such an obvious thing, you couldn't miss it.
Yeah. Now, building control now, just a few questions about them. In your first witness statement, this is at page 3, paragraph L, little l, you say that the building inspector had oversight of the installation process. And then perhaps if we can let's look at that. So OSB 6087, page 3, so little l. We can see at L after K, there's the question, what was the chain of decision-making, communication and responsibility? And you say Harley made all the decisions in relation to how the cladding, insulation and windows were to be installed. Osborne Berry installed items as directed, and you say the building inspector had oversight of the installation process. And then at the bottom of that page, at paragraph 5, you also say that there was inspection. If we pick it up in the middle, you say there was an inspection carried out by Ben Bailey from Harley Facades Limited, Harley Curtain Wall, Ryden Maintenance Limited, and the local council building inspector, all confirmed that there were no issues in relation to the installation of the windows and the cladding. Now, were you aware at the time of the project that somebody called Mr. Hoban was responsible for inspecting the cladding from RBKC Building Control?
No, I wasn't.
So you didn't ever get introduced to the building control inspectors themselves?
Not at all. The only inspector I remember was the building control, clerk of the works.
Ah, okay. Mr.
Sorry.
White.
Yes, that's the only man I can remember, and I actually took him up once in a mast climber.
Now, so you took John White up once
I
in
did.
the mast climber?
I did.
Did you ever go up the mast climbers with Mr. Hoban or RBKC Building Control?
Not that I can remember.
Okay. Were you ever present at any of the building control inspections?
No.
Mr. Hoban has said that a number of things were said to him on site. For example, that the cladding was compliant with the building regulations, that it had been used in hundreds of other buildings. Could it have been you that he was having any of those discussions with?
Not that I'm aware of.
So you don't recall telling
Don't.
a building control inspector anything about the compliance of the system or how frequently this system had been fitted to buildings in England and Wales?
I don't remember having conversations with the building control, to be honest.
Great, thank you. The clerk of works then, so Mr. John White, did you understand him to be the clerk of works on
I
the
did.
project?
I did.
Did you understand him to be on site one day a week or more frequently than
I
that?
wasn't sure how many days a week he was on site.
I see.
I've only learnt that today from the earlier
Yeah.
interview.
And I think you've just said that you were present when he, one time.
I took him up once in the Mass Climber.
Yeah. Can you help us as to whether or not the clerk of works was inspecting the cladding so far as you were aware more
He was
frequently?
looking
than
at
that?
everything, taking photos of various things.
So you were aware that he was going up the mass climbers?
I was, yes. Yes.
And how often were you aware of him doing that?
Good. I really wouldn't like to say because I cannot remember. But I know he was on site and Ben took him up a few times. And I think he went up with Dave a few times. There was quite a few times he was up the building.
Yeah.
Quite a few.
Were you aware of precisely what he was checking for?
No.
Did you ever see any of his site inspection reports?
No.
The final topic that I've got now is about some complaints and issues to do with complaints. And if we can turn first to, this is IWS 501705. This is a witness statement of Mr. Luke Towner, who was the resident of flat 171. And if we could look on page 6 at paragraph 27, and I want to pick it up in the third line down of paragraph 27. He says, whilst the cladding was being installed, I thought to myself that it must be necessary to use fire retardant material on buildings the height of Grenfell Tower. I therefore asked one of the contractors whether the materials being used were compliant with building regulations for high-rise buildings and whether they were using fire retardant insulation. He responded that he was unsure and would need to get the manager to speak to me. And then he says Linda Prentice from Ryden came to speak to me about the insulation. Now, do you recall ever speaking to this resident or indeed any other residents of Grenfell Tower regarding compliance of the materials with the building regulations?
Not at all. I only actually spoke to one person really in the tower who is no longer with us, and he was lived on the east elevation, and that is the only person I really held deep conversations with.
Yeah.
Because he was also into sea fishing like I am. But as for anybody else, I don't remember this.
Can we now look at an email chain? This is RYD 3039173. This is an email chain between Ryden and Harley. If we look at the bottom of page 1 and over to page 2, Miss Prentice, Ryden's resident liaison officer, says to Simon O'Connor, it's about flat 185, and if we go over the page, she said, "Hi Simon, I just received a text from David Collins in flat 185 stating that he found part of the window installation hanging loose this morning. He's taken it into his house, he didn't want it to fall the 18 floors. And also that there's some polythene on the back of one of the cladding panels blowing in the wind has nearly come off. Can it be taken off safely?" And we can see at the very top of page 1, Ben Bailey says, back to Simon O'Connor. Yep, I'll ask Taff to go and have a look. Can you remember this complaint about cladding panels hanging loose?
No, the
and
cladding panel wasn't actually loose. What had happened is the low-tack tape on the panel had come away from the bottom of the panel. So as the wind was blowing, the low-tack tape was flapping backwards and forwards on the panel. So I just removed the low-tack tape completely off the panel to open and expose the actual face of the panel, basically.
Yeah. Can we then turn to RYD 3038501? This is an email from Simon O'Connor to Ben Bailey of the 9th of April 2015. And he says, "Afternoon, Ben. I have concerns over a certain member of your staff on site, Bez, Taff's partner, following a number of complaints. These comprise of knocking on windows asking for tea, in jest or not, it's not acceptable, banging on people's windows to scare animals inside flats. I have witnessed this on one occasion. Feeding the wrong information to residents, saying that it's all been put in the wrong way round because of Ryden and hopefully it won't leak. A complete lack of respect for health and safety, climbing across climbers, dropping material on public footpaths, to mention a few. As you are aware, we are tackling a difficult situation with residents as it is, and these sorts of comments and behaviours only adds fuel to the fire. If I have one more incident on site with this individual, then I will have no option but to remove him from site permanently. Regards, Simon O'Connor." Do you see that there?
I do.
Now, Mr. Ben Bailey was asked about this email, and at the time, we'd redacted the Bez, Taff's partner.
Yes, I know that. Yeah, I know all about that.
So we can see now that this complaint was about Graham Berry, your business partner, yes?
It certainly was. I've known Graham probably 35 years. This is not something Graham would do. I asked Mr. O'Connor for corroborative evidence,
Yes.
and I then asked Mr. O'Connor why a yellow card wasn't issued, when a week previous, or 2 weeks previous, he'd issued a yellow card to one of my young fitters for swearing at a resident.
Right. And what did he say in response?
He didn't. He walked away from me.
Right.
Now, I had a word with Graham. Graham said he hadn't done that. I personally don't think he would have done that. So I let it go at that, basically.
I see. So was that your response to Ryden at the time, and
It
indeed
was.
to Ben Bailey, that you just didn't accept that this had happened?
No. And the falling objects, that happened very early on in the contract. When we were drilling the holes for the angles to hold the windows, behind the insulation, as you've probably seen, it's a very pebbly surface.
Yes.
Very large flints on there. I asked Rydens to supply a catch net to stop anything falling down onto people below. Because what was happening, they supplied a fan, which is a scaffold boarded fan at an angle. But as you're probably aware, if a pebble's not quite the right shape, it doesn't need to say it's going to go inwards. It could go left, right, or straight ahead. They told me it wasn't within their remit to do that. So I then had to make boxes that went between the mast climber and the wall.
Yeah.
So that if anything fell off when the drills hit the pebbles, they dropped straight in the boxes.
I see.
This was made by Mr. O'Connor, a big thing, basically.
I see. So where there's reference here to a complete lack of respect for health and safety, that reference then in brackets to dropping material on public footpaths, you're sure, are you, that that's what that's referring to?
I would assume that's what that's referring
see.
to, because the only ever time we had anything come down off a mast climber was the wind got up and blew some bits of insulation down.
Right. Yeah.
You can't keep those safe 100% of the time. Even if you put them in a bag and the wind gets up, they just blow out the bag.
And what about climbing across climates?
That I did catch two people doing, and they were told about that, and that never happened again.
And was one of those people Mr.
No.
Berry?
No, it was not.
Were you ever aware of Mr. Berry doing that?
No. No, I wouldn't have thought Graham would have done that. One thing is he doesn't like heights to do that sort of thing.
And what about telling residents wrong or false information about the cladding?
I don't believe that either.
Mr. Ben Bailey said he spoke to Mr. Berry and said that the behaviour was unacceptable. Were you aware that
I
that had
was
happened?
aware of that. I was actually there when he spoke to him.
And what was Mr. Berry's response when Ben Bailey raised this with him?
I didn't do it, Bez
Right.
said.
So is it right that you didn't put in place any steps to address this because you weren't satisfied that there was anything to complain about?
Correct.
Mr. Chairman, I've come to the end of my questions.
All right, thank you very much.
If we could have the customary break
Yes.
to allow me to sweep up anything further, that would be great.
Of course. Well, Mr. Osborne, as you heard, Council's reached the end of the questions that she had in mind to ask you, but we normally have a break at this stage just to allow Council to check that there aren't any questions that have been left unasked. And it sometimes occurs that people who are not here send questions in they'd like to have asked as well. So we have a 10-15 minute break. How long do you think you're going to need?
Yeah, I think 10 minutes should be fine.
Right, well, we'll
Fine.
come back at 25 past, please, and see whether there are more questions.
Question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
25 past, then, please. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Mr. Osborne to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Osborne, should we see if Miss Grange has found some more questions for you?
Thank you.
Yes, Miss Grange?
Yes, just a few short
Oh,
questions.
yes. Thank you.
So just to clarify something about the scope of Osborne Berry's work on the windows, is it right that Osborne Berry did not install the actual fans in the kitchen window units? Is that correct?
We didn't install them.
Yeah.
The electricians put them in the panels. Then we installed the panel into the window with the fan fitted in it.
I see. Okay. That's really helpful. Thank you. And then you were talking before about the fact that you had made sure that the horizontal cavity barriers were stored separate from the vertical cavity barriers.
Correct.
Can you help us as to where exactly you had stored the vertical cavity barriers on site?
Well, there was I don't know what you'd call it, a garage. If you come into Grenfell Tower by the front entrance, on the left-hand side, there was 2 garages.
Yeah.
We used the garages as storage.
Yeah.
So we had one garage for us, and we split it in half. And we had one lot of stuff that side and one lot of stuff that side, basically.
Right. Yeah.
That's how they were individualised.
I see. And you split out. You remember splitting out the horizontal
Yeah.
from the vertical. Do
You not being funny, the fitters should not. This is, I know after what we've seen, it's bad, but the fitters should not have made the mistake, because one has got an intermittent strip on it, and it's so obviously different to the other one.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, it's chalk and cheese, basically.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, those are all the
Fantastic.
questions. Just
Good. Well, thank you very much. Well, Mr. Osborne, thank you very much indeed for coming to give your evidence. It really has been very useful to hear what you've had to say. That's all we have for you, so you're now free to go.
Thank you very much
Thank
indeed.
you very much. Good. Thank you, Ms. Grange.
It's okay.
That's it for today.
yes. And then tomorrow we have Mr. Graham Berry and Mr. Mark Dixon.
Good. Thank you very much. Well, we'll stop at that point and resume tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, please. Thank you very much.